Good evening. I don't know what prompted that immediate universal silence, but thank you. Apparently it's time to begin. How's the sound in the back, friends? Good? Many thanks to those who have endeavored to make this space okay. Many thanks to those who have endeavored to make this space a good one for tonight's presentation. And indeed, we have a very special presentation, the first keynote of this Olney Friends School Summit. Michael Shellenberger, just arrived in time for dinner, and I don't know whether he got much dinner. We may need to take him back afterwards to make sure he's in good shape, but we whisked him away pretty quickly. He's on his way back home from Washington, D.C., where he had some meetings this morning, but we're really honored that Michael's taken a few hours to stop here in the Midwest, in the heartland, at this very special place and with this special group of people to share some of his wisdom with us. Those of you who don't know Michael and his work, he's an Earlham graduate. Some of you may appreciate that. Told you. I'm not an Earlham graduate, but I have a fondness for Earlham. Mike, since graduating from Earlham in, I think I heard 93, which was last century sometime, Michael's been very busy. And he's currently the president, co-founder of the Breakthrough Institute, Oakland, California. He and Ted Nordhaus wrote a book called Breakthrough. I'm thinking of the two subtitles, and the preferable one is Why We Can't Leave Saving the Planet to Environmentalists. Michael tells me that, in fact, this book has won a number of awards and wide acclaim, but some of their other writing, including an article that was debated in the New York Times called The Death of Environmentalism, has received more attention than the book, apparently, but we'll hear about their work. Obviously, this gentleman is widely respected and is doing important work, and we're really pleased that he's here to give us a presentation this evening. Please welcome Michael Shellenberger.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank Rich and Kirsten for bringing me out. It's really nice to be back in a Quaker community. Do we want to dim the lights a little bit, or no? Oh, okay. Let's turn them off. Can we do that? Let's see. Why don't you just turn one of them off? Yeah, that's great. And then if the people in the back want it off, then that's totally up to you. Is that okay? Does that mess up your plan? You're okay? All right. You know, I'm going to start with this wonderful Michelangelo. It is Michelangelo, right? The Sistine Chapel. There's an DR. Where is he? I have my art historian back there. Michelangelo, right? Which this is a lovely detail, of course, from the creation story where you see God touching Adam, I believe, with the laptop covering up what was in fact is there for everybody to see, and is really a wonderful celebration of the human body, and I think a celebration of kind of humankind's power and potential and beauty, which will contrast a bit with some of the other art you'll see. But first, let's just get a little bit of, get the credentialing out of the way. This is a book that we wrote in 2007 called Breakthrough. We are long-standing environmentalists. We live in California. We've worked to save redwoods, worked on global warming. I've worked for basically every environmental group in the country, from the Sierra Club to Earth First to the big environmental foundations. We broke from many of our colleagues in 2004 after about 10 years of doing this work in an essay we called The Death of Environmentalism, and the argument was not that environmentalism had died, but really what has been environmentalism needs to die, because what environmentalism is right now is actually insufficient to dealing with what we called the most important environmental problem of the day, which is global warming. We wrote this book then 3 years later. We were named Heroes of the Environment by Time Magazine, which recognized a set of the arguments that we made in the book as a bit before their time. We now have a small think tank in Oakland, California, which is a very odd place to have a think tank, especially if you're doing federal policy, which we do. But we're in California in part because we want to be away from Washington. We sort of celebrate, in many ways, being on the margins, which obviously is, I think, something that is a Quaker community can appreciate, the importance of being on the margins. And we were critics of President Obama's cap-and-trade climate legislation, which failed in the Senate. We argued that that wasn't an approach that was going to deliver the world a clean energy economy. And we have been big advocates of making direct investments to make clean energy much cheaper so that the countries, all the countries of the world might eventually scale it up and use it to replace fossil fuels, which will be an argument that we'll work towards to the end of this presentation. Rich, do you think you could move that computer a little closer to where you are so that way I don't have to keep looking backwards and I can just look at the computer? That's great. So we're going to start with two stories of human beings on Earth, big stories. The first one is a very old story, and it's a story about human hubris, the way that that's a sin, the fall from nature and from harmony, and the coming end of the world. And this is, I hasten to add, though I'm not a Christian, this is not the only story that Christians tell. It's one Christian story, but it's a problematic story for a few reasons. So this is, of course, how this story imagines humans lived in harmony with nature. Everything was all good. There was, we were at one. You can even see in the lower left-hand corner, I think I have a little pointer here. You can see even the tigers are playing with each other. So a very beautiful, harmonious scene. But then, of course, you can see what's happening here. Eve is starting to reach from the tree of knowledge, and that one might interpret that as a metaphor for the dawn of agriculture, of using science and technology to control nature rather than be in its womb, so to speak. And that is the beginning of the Troubles, as we all know. And it's a story that we see picked up throughout the literature of the environmental movement. All life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. This is the opening to the very famous Silent Spring, which was maybe the foundational text of the modern environmental movement, which begins in the 60s. Here's Rachel Carson. And you see the idea here, of course, is that the Eden she's describing is really bucolic life. It looks a lot like my drive-in today, where everything was in harmony. And this story of hubris, of course, is a very old one. It predates Christianity. Here's Daedalus and Icarus helping his son to fly with homemade fashioned wings. That looks like a pretty good start there, but we all know what happens. Icarus flies too close to the sun, and this is a cautionary tale of hubris. Don't try to achieve too much. Don't expect your technologies will save you. Here's a more recent version of the Icarus myth. The other myth, of course, is Prometheus. Here's Prometheus gloriously stealing fire from the gods to deliver to humans. This is I love this painting. But of course, we know how that ends. Prometheus is sentenced to have his liver eaten out every day by vultures for his sin of really hubris against the gods. And we know that, here's a Masaccio painting. This is the expulsion from Eden. You can see the anguish and the suffering, all of which is a result not of Eve trying to eat an apple or trying to feed her children, but of having sinned in some fundamental way and having been overtaken by evil. And of course, we know how this story ends. It ends in the book of Revelations with an apocalypse and the four horsemen of the apocalypse doing all sorts of things that bringing pestilence and death and disease. So that's the basic story. Now, for modern environmentalists, by the time you get around to the late 60s, you start getting concerns that we're going to run out of food. And so one of the most famous books of the era, a book that made it onto Johnny Carson, was this book by Paul Ehrlich, who's a Stanford professor, a Stanford ecologist. Here he is in 1968, and the subject is Population Control or Race to Oblivion. And the idea is either we will restrict people from having children or we're all going to die. And the idea is there's really not enough room for all of us. Here's a quote from the book about his visit to India, people thrusting their hands through the taxi window, begging, people defecating and urinating, people clinging to buses, people hurting animals, people. I think what is the most important word in this passage is the word animals. And the sense, of course, is this reminder that we are animals and we are overpopulated. It's a concept that comes from ecological biology. He wondered, would we ever get to our hotel? All three of us were frightened. He's with his wife and his young daughter. India couldn't possibly feed 200 million more people by 1980, he concludes. There's just absolutely no way. 1968. Here's an updated version of it. It's Al Gore after the hurricane hit Katrina in 2005. You see Al Gore resorting to biblical references. It was almost like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. The truth about the climate crisis is an inconvenient one. That means we're going to have to change the way we live our lives. So the idea of these cautionary tales is that we are fallen, we are living in a fallen existence from an original sin. That sin is some combination of modernity, of science, of technology, of hubris against an originary harmonious state. And what we discovered in writing our book is that this narrative is actually identical to the narrative of a depressed person. We stumbled across a very good psychologist. His name is Aaron Beck. I wonder if anybody heard of Aaron Beck? Raise your hand. Oh, look at that. Wonderful. Here he is with the Dalai Lama, as wonderful as in his old age as he was as a young man. He is the founder of something called cognitive therapy. And he discovered, I mean, arguably it goes back further than him, but he put it in modern psychoanalytical language. He found that depressed people share three core beliefs. My world is bleak, I'm no good, and my future is hopeless. This is a statement about the world, about the self, and about the future. And Beck said, you have to talk back to these narratives, that there's not just one you, there's a number of voices in your head. Some of us have more of them than others. I had several conversations with them today. And you have to talk back to them because these are, maybe you did something wrong, but that doesn't mean that you're all bad. And maybe there's things about the world that we don't like, but that doesn't mean that the world is in a fallen state. And maybe there's problems that we have to deal with in the future, but that doesn't mean that the future is hopeless. The cognitive therapy I practice, I do while I'm running. So by the time I get done with a 6 or 7 mile run, I've usually been able to bark back, although it may be just the exhaustion, against some of those negative narratives. And I think what we wanted to do with Breakthrough is we wanted to actually make Breakthrough a kind of cognitive therapy for the environmental movement. Its success was, well,